No good deed goes unpunished. It's a cynical rule, but in a city that runs on greed, it's the truth. When a waitress risked her only source of income to buy a bowl of soup for a freezing, disoriented old man, her boss threw her out into the street. He thought she was just another expendable girl. He thought the old man was just a nameless drifter. He was dead wrong on both counts. Because that old man's son, he owned the city. The rain in Chicago didn't just fall, it attacked. It drove down in cold gray sheets, turning the sidewalks into slick black mirrors. Inside Le Petit Jardin, the air smelled of roasted garlic, pretentious truffle oil, and money. Chloe stood behind the mahogany host stand, her arches screaming in cheap flats. She had been on her feet for 7 hours. 3 more to go. She watched the wealthy patrons slice into $40 steaks, while she mentally calculated if she had enough in her checking account to cover both her gas bill and groceries this week. The math wasn't working in her favor. Table 4 needs more water. Don't just stand there looking decorative, Chloe. Gregory, the general manager. He was a man who wore suits one size too small to emphasize his chest, and spoke to the staff like they were slow children. He wiped a microscopic speck of dust off the reservation tablet, scowling at the door. The brass bell chimed. The man who walked in didn't belong in Le Petit Jardin. He was elderly, frail, and soaked to the bone. Water dripped from the brim of a sodden tweed fedora. His suit was expensive, or it had been a decade ago, but he wore no overcoat against the November freeze. He stood in the entryway, shivering violently, looking around with pale, milky eyes that held absolutely no recognition of where he was. Gregory noticed him immediately. His nose wrinkled in disgust. "Get him out!" Gregory hissed, barely moving his lips. He shoved a menu into Chloe's ribs. "Now." "He's freezing, Gregory," Chloe said quietly. "Look at him. He's lost." "I don't care if he's the ghost of Christmas past. This is a Michelin-starred establishment, not a soup kitchen. He's ruining the ambiance. Handle it or I will." Chloe walked towards the door. The old man was rubbing his paper-thin hands together. His knuckles were blue. He looked at Chloe, his chin trembling. I was supposed to meet my wife," he whispered. His voice was like dry leaves. "She said she would be at the corner." But the corner moved. Chloe felt a heavy, dull ache in her chest. It was a city of millions, and no one had stopped to help a man who thought the street corners were moving. She looked back at Gregory. He made a sharp, dismissive jerking motion with his thumb towards the street. Chloe didn't point him to the door. Instead, she gently placed her hand on the old man's damp shoulder. "Come with me. Let's get you warm first." She guided him to a small two-top near the kitchen doors, out of the direct line of sight from the main dining room. She pulled out a chair. He sank into it, his breathing shallow and ragged. "I'll be right back," she promised. She walked into the kitchen, grabbed a bowl of the day's potato leek soup, and plated it with a warm sourdough roll. When she emerged, Gregory was waiting. His face was a dark, mottled red. "What do you think you're doing?" Gregory's voice was a low, dangerous scrape. "I'm ringing it up under my employee number," Chloe said, sidestepping him. "I'm paying for it." "You aren't paying for anything. You're throwing him out." "He has dementia, Gregory. It's freezing outside. He just needs a minute to warm up while I call the police to help find his family." Gregory grabbed her arm. Not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to make a point. "You don't make the calls here. I do. And I say he leaves. You take that bowl to him, and you can take your coat and walk out the door right after him." Chloe looked at the bowl of soup in her hands. Steam curled off the surface. She looked at the old man, who was staring at his empty hands, lost in a world she couldn't understand. Then she looked at Gregory, the petty, miserable tyrant who enjoyed crushing people just because he could. She hated this job. She hated the uniform. She hated him. Chloe pulled her arm free. She walked over to the old man, set the soup down, and placed a heavy silver spoon next to his hand. "Eat up," she said softly. It's good. The old man looked up at her, a faint, fragile smile breaking through his confusion. Thank you, dear. Chloe untied her black apron. She dropped it on the floor right in front of Gregory's polished loafers. I'll need my final check mailed, she said. She walked into the back room, grabbed her damp wool coat, and walked out the back alley door. The cold air hit her lungs like glass. She was jobless. Rent was due in 4 days. She had $32 to her name. She pulled her collar up and stepped into the rain. By 1 o'clock, the lunch rush at Le Petit Jardin was in full swing. Gregory was in his element, kissing the cheeks of socialites and comping glasses of champagne for local politicians. He had already forgotten about the waitress and the old man. The old man was still sitting by the kitchen, slowly finishing his bread. Gregory had called the non-emergency police line an hour ago to have him removed, but they were taking their time. Then, the street outside went dead. It didn't happen all at once. First, a massive, matte black SUV blocked the loading zone in front of the restaurant. Then another pulled up behind it. And a third. The heavy rain bounced off the tinted windows. 4 men stepped out into the downpour. They didn't run. They didn't huddle under umbrellas. They just walked toward the glass doors of the restaurant with a slow, deliberate purpose that made the valet step back against the brick wall and swallow hard. When they opened the doors, the ambient noise of the restaurant began to die. It started near the entrance and spread like a wave of cold air. Clinking forks paused. Conversations faltered. 3 of the men were broad, built like brick walls, wearing dark suits that bulged slightly at the ribs. But it was the man in the center who pulled the oxygen out of the room. Dominic Russo didn't look like a thug. He looked like old money and new violence. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit, perfectly tailored to a lean, athletic frame. His dark hair was slightly damp from the rain. His eyes, a pale, startling gray, swept the room with the mechanical precision of a camera lens. He wasn't looking for a table. Gregory hurried forward. His customer service smile was firmly in place, but a line of sweat broke out at his hairline. He knew who Dominic Russo was. Anyone in Chicago who handled cash, real estate, or unions knew who he was. Mr. Russo, Gregory said, his voice pitching a half octave too high. What an unexpected honor. I'm afraid we are at capacity. But if you give me just 3 minutes, I can clear the chef's table. Dominic held up a single finger. Gregory stopped talking instantly. His mouth snapped shut. Dominic didn't look at Gregory. His grey eyes had found the small table near the kitchen. He walked past the manager, his leather shoes silent on the hardwood floor. He stopped in front of the old man. The 3 bodyguards fanned out, effectively walling off the table from the rest of the dining room. Dad, Dominic said. His voice was low, rough, and surprisingly gentle. Arthur looked up. The milky confusion in his eyes cleared for a fraction of a second. Dominic, I was looking for your mother. I must have taken the wrong train. You did, Dominic said, kneeling on the floor. He didn't care about the spilled wine or the dirt. He took his father's cold hands in his. She's at home. We've been looking for you. It's very cold outside, Arthur murmured. But a nice girl gave me some soup. She paid for it. Dominic's jaw flexed. The muscle ticked rhythmically under his skin. He stood up slowly, turning his attention back to Gregory, who was now standing completely still, his face drained of all color. Who gave him the soup? Dominic asked. The volume of his voice didn't rise, but it carried to the back of the room. A server. Chloe, Gregory stammered. Fetch her. Gregory swallowed audibly. She's not here, Mr. Russo. She was let go. Dominic stepped closer. The distance between them was less than a foot. Gregory had to physically stop himself from backing away. You fired her, Dominic stated. It wasn't a question. She violated protocol, Gregory said, desperation leaking into his tone. He was disrupting the guests. We have a strict policy about vagrants. He stopped. The look in Dominic's eyes wasn't anger. Anger was hot, loud and messy. This was something else. This was absolute zero. "My father," Dominic said softly, "is not a vagrant. He is Arthur Russo. He helped build half the skyline you stare at through these windows." Dominic reached into his jacket pocket. Gregory flinched, but Dominic only pulled out a slim, black leather wallet. He extracted a crisp $100 bill and dropped it onto the floor at Gregory's feet. "For the soup," Dominic said. He gestured to one of his men, who gently helped Arthur to his feet and draped a heavy cashmere coat over his shoulders. Dominic leaned in, dropping his voice so only Gregory could hear. "I own the holding company that holds the mortgage to this building. You have 30 days left on your lease. By 5 o'clock today, you'll receive notice that it's not being renewed. By next month, this place will be a parking lot." Gregory opened his mouth, a pathetic noise escaping his throat. "Mr. Russo, please, I didn't know." "I don't care," Dominic said. He turned his back on the manager, completely dismissing him from existence. He looked at the bodyguard closest to the door. "Find the girl." 3 days. It took exactly 3 days for the panic to set in. Chloe sat in a vinyl booth at a 24-hour diner on the edge of the city, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt battery acid. Her laptop was open, the screen glowing with 50 different rejection emails and automated responses. She rubbed her eyes. The headache sitting right behind her temples pulsed in time with the diner's flickering neon sign. Rent was due tomorrow. She had pawned her grandmother's silver locket yesterday for $60, which bought her a week of groceries and subway fare. It was a temporary bandage over a massive arterial bleed. She took a sip of the terrible coffee. "Should have let Gregory throw him out," a dark, cynical voice whispered in her head. She shoved the thought away. No, she was broke, tired, and desperate. But she wasn't Gregory. The diner door opened. The brass bells jingled brightly, completely at odds with the man who walked in. He was in his late 30s, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than Chloe's car. He didn't look around aimlessly. He scanned the room, locked onto Chloe, and walked directly toward her booth. Chloe felt her stomach drop. Debt collectors didn't wear suits like that. Landlords didn't either. The man stopped at the edge of a table. "Chloe Hayes." "Depends on who's asking," she said, closing her laptop defensively. "My name is Luca. I work for someone who would very much like to speak with you. I'm not buying anything, and I don't owe anyone money. Well, not anyone who can afford that tie." Luca offered a tight, polite smile. "It's not about a debt you owe, Ms. Hayes. It's about a debt owed to you. My employer's car is outside. He asked for 5 minutes of your time." Chloe looked out the greasy diner window. Parked by the curb, idling silently in the grey afternoon light, was a black Maybach. It looked like a shark resting in a kiddie pool. "No thanks," Chloe said. "I know how this city works. Guys in black cars don't hand out favors for free. Tell your boss I'm busy." Luca didn't move. He didn't blink. "Ms. Hayes, 3 days ago you bought a bowl of soup for an elderly man at Le Petit Jardin. You lost your job because of it. My employer is that man's son." Chloe froze, the old man in the rain. She looked back at the Maybach. She thought about her empty bank account. She thought about the pawn shop. "Fine," she muttered, grabbing her coat. 5 minutes, and if this is some weird scam, I have pepper spray." "Noted," Luca said mildly. He walked her out to the car and opened the heavy rear door. Chloe slid inside. The interior smelled of expensive leather and faint cedar. Sitting in the far corner, half-shadowed by the tinted windows, was Dominic. He was looking at a tablet in his lap. He didn't look up immediately. He let the silence stretch, a deliberate tactic of intimidation. Chloe wasn't having it. "Clock's ticking. I've got resumes to send." Dominic slowly locked the tablet and turned his head. Chloe's breath hitched slightly, though she hid it well. Up close, his eyes were unnervingly intense. They were the color of slate, cold and measuring. He looked at her the way a man looks at a locked door, figuring out how to pick it. "You're not what I expected," Dominic said. His voice was a low, smooth baritone. "Sorry to disappoint. I left my tiara at home." The corner of Dominic's mouth twitched. "Barely. My father is doing well. He asked me to thank you." "I'm glad he's okay," Chloe said, and meant it. The edge in her voice softened. "He shouldn't have been out there alone. He won't be again." Dominic reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, sealed white envelope. He held it out to her. "I don't like owing debts. This covers your lost wages, with interest." Chloe looked at the envelope. It was thick, disgustingly thick. It was probably enough to pay her rent for a year. Her hand twitched, but then she looked at Dominic. He looked bored. He looked like a man who solved all his problems by throwing cash at them, expecting people to bow and scrape in gratitude. Chloe sat back against the leather seat, crossing her arms. "Keep it." Dominic paused. The envelope hovered in the space between them. For the first time, a flicker of genuine surprise crossed his features. "Excuse me?" "I said keep it," Chloe repeated, her chin lifting. "I didn't buy a $10 soup for a payout. I did it because your father was freezing and my boss was a prick. I'm not a charity case. You have $32 in your checking account, Ms. Hayes. Your landlord slipped an eviction warning under your door yesterday." Chloe's blood went ice cold. "You looked into my bank account? I look into everyone before I let them in my car," Dominic said plainly, dropping the envelope onto the center console. "Pride is a luxury for the rich. You can't afford it. Take the money." "Screw you!" Chloe snapped, reaching for the door handle. "Unlock the door. You want to walk back out there?" Dominic challenged, his voice sharpening. "Go back to fighting for minimum wage? Dealing with men like Gregory? It's better than taking blood money from a guy who hacks my bank account to prove a point." She rattled the handle. "Open it." Dominic studied her. The boredom was entirely gone from his expression. Now there was sharp, calculating interest. He tapped the glass partition. "Luca, leave it locked." Chloe whipped her head around to glare at him. "Kidnapping? Cool. Add it to your resume." "I'm not giving you money, Chloe," Dominic said. The use of her first name felt sudden, heavy in the quiet car. "I'm offering you a job." Chloe stopped pulling on the handle. "A job doing what? I pour coffee. I manage reservations. I don't know how to do whatever it is you do. I own hotels, casinos, real estate." Dominic said smoothly. "I have a private dining club downtown. My previous manager was caught stealing from the wine cellar. The position is open. The pay is 4 times what Gregory was giving you, plus benefits." Chloe stared at him. "Why?" "Because you didn't flinch when my man walked into that diner. You didn't grovel when I offered you cash. And you stood up for a man who could do absolutely nothing for you." Dominic leaned forward slightly. The cedar scent wrapped around her. "I can teach someone how to manage a floor. I can't teach loyalty or backbone." He picked up the envelope and held it out again. "This is your signing bonus. If you want the job, take it. If you don't, Luca will unlock the door, and you will never see me again." Chloe looked at the money. Then she looked into the grey, ruthless eyes of Dominic Russo. She knew what he was. You didn't live in Chicago, and not know the rumors about the Russo family. It wasn't just hotels and casinos. There was blood in the mortar of his empire. Taking the money meant stepping into his world. A world that was infinitely more dangerous than an angry restaurant manager. She thought about the pawn shop. She thought about the freezing rain. Slowly, deliberately, Chloe reached out and took the envelope. Dominic's eyes flashed with something dark and satisfied. "Welcome to the payroll, Chloe." The Sovereign Club occupied the entire penthouse floor of a glass and steel monolith overlooking the Chicago River. It didn't have a sign. It didn't have a website. If you didn't know the designated elevator code, the car simply wouldn't go past the 42nd floor. Chloe stood by the host stand on a Tuesday night, checking the reservation ledger. She wore a tailored black dress that the club's tailor had fitted to her on her first day. The fabric felt like water against her skin. It was armor. Her first 2 weeks had been a brutal education. Managing Le Petit Jardin was about handling rich people who thought they were important. Managing the sovereign was about handling quiet men who actually were. Politicians, judges, and men with thick necks and dead eyes who drank $1,000 scotch and never left a paper trail. She learned the rules fast. You didn't ask questions. You didn't look too closely at the briefcases exchanged in the private mahogany booths. And you never, ever let them see you sweat. Ms. Hayes. Chloe looked up. Luca stood near the coat check, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He was always there. Dominic's shadow, keeping a quiet, lethal watch over the floor. Table 6 is getting loud, Luca said softly. Chloe glanced across the dimly lit room. The lighting was designed to cast shadows, hiding faces and muting colors, but she could clearly see the man in the corner booth. Paulie Ganza, a mid-level capo who ran the docks for a rival family. He had a voice like a grinding garbage disposal and a habit of treating the female staff like furniture. Right now, he had his hand clamped around the wrist of a young cocktail waitress named Maya, pulling her uncomfortably close. "I'll handle it," Chloe said. Luca shifted his weight. "Mr. Russo is in the building. He wouldn't mind if I stepped in." "If you step in, Paulie loses face. If he loses face, he gets defensive. It escalates," Chloe said, grabbing a fresh bottle of Macallan 25 from the reserve cabinet. "Let me do my job, Luca." She walked across the plush carpet, her heels completely silent. When she reached the table, she didn't bark an order. She didn't look at Paulie's hand on Maya's wrist. Instead, she set the heavy crystal decanter down with a firm, sharp clack that cut through Paulie's laughter. "Mr. Ganza," Chloe said. Her voice was smooth, cool, and carried absolute authority. "I noticed your glass was empty. We can't have that." Paulie looked up, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. He didn't let go of Maya. "I didn't order another bottle, sweetheart." "It's on the house," Chloe said, holding his gaze. She didn't blink. She didn't smile. She projected the exact same terrifying, blank authority she had seen Dominic use in the back of the Maybach. "Mr. Russo insists that our most valued guests are taken care of. He's reviewing the ledger in his office right now, and he specifically asked me to ensure your table is entirely satisfied." She let the name drop like an anvil. Russo. Paulie's jaw tightened. He looked at the bottle, then up at the ceiling, as if calculating just how many cameras were on him. Slowly, the thick fingers uncurled from Maya's wrist. "Maya," Chloe said, not breaking eye contact with Paulie. "Go check on table 3. I'll pour for Mr. Ganza." The waitress scurried away. Chloe picked up the decanter and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into Paulie's glass. "Tell Dominic thanks," Paulie muttered, looking away. "I will," Chloe said. "Enjoy your evening, gentlemen." She turned and walked away, keeping her shoulders squared until she passed the velvet curtains leading to the back hallway. The moment she was out of sight, she leaned against the wall, blowing out a long, shaky breath. Her hands were trembling slightly. She pressed them flat against the cold silk wallpaper. "You handled him perfectly." Chloe jumped. Dominic was standing in the shadows near the kitchen entrance. He wore a black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing a lattice of faded, brutal scars along his left forearm. He held a glass of water, watching her. "How long were you standing there?" she asked, willing her heart rate to slow down. "Long enough to see Paulie Ganza back down from a woman half his size," Dominic said. He stepped closer. The hallway was narrow. The scent of cedar and gunpowder hung faintly in the air around him. "You used my name as a weapon." "It worked. It did." Dominic leaned against the opposite wall, crossing his ankles. It was the most relaxed she had ever seen him. "But you took a risk. Ganza is unpredictable when he drinks. If he had decided to push back, What was your next move? I was going to smash the decanter over his head. Chloe said deadpan. Dominic actually laughed. It was a rare, startling sound. Deep and genuine. It changed his entire face, erasing the ruthless Mafia kingpin and leaving behind a man who looked remarkably human. Remind me never to complain about the service. He murmured. He looked at her, the laughter fading, replaced by that heavy, measuring stare. But it wasn't the same look he gave her in the car weeks ago. It wasn't an assessment of her usefulness. It was something heavier, something that made the air in the hallway feel suddenly very thin. You're doing well here, Chloe. The staff respects you. The floor is running 20% higher in profits. He took a step forward. Are you happy? The question threw her. Happy? She was safe. Her rent was paid 6 months in advance. She had a savings account. But she was living in a world built on a powder keg. I'm secure, she said carefully. I don't have to look at the prices on a grocery menu anymore. For me, that's close enough. Dominic's jaw flexed. He reached out, his fingers stopping an inch from her cheek, hovering in the space between them. It was a question, a line he wouldn't cross without permission. Chloe held her breath. She didn't pull away. Before he could bridge the gap, the heavy oak door at the end of the hall slammed open. Luca appeared, his face tight. Dominic, Luca said sharply. We have a problem downstairs. It's Moretti's crew. The warmth vanished from Dominic's eyes, replaced instantly by glacial ice. The kingpin was back. He dropped his hand and turned away. Lock down the elevators, Dominic ordered, already moving. Nobody gets off this floor. The violence didn't start with a scream. It started with a heavy, muted thud that vibrated through the floorboards of the club. It was 2:15 a.m. The Sovereign had officially closed at 2. Only a skeleton crew remained. Chloe, 3 bartenders counting the registers, and Dominic's men. Chloe was in the back office, finalizing the nightly deposit, when the lights flickered and died. Emergency floor lighting kicked in, painting the room in a sickly, pale orange glow. Then came the gunfire. It wasn't like the movies. It was deafening, a staccato roar of concussive pops that made Chloe's teeth ache. The sound of shattering glass followed, thousands of dollars of vintage liquor raining down onto the hardwood floor. Chloe didn't freeze. Growing up in the South Side, you learned early that freezing got you killed. She dropped to the floor, instantly crawling under the heavy mahogany desk. She reached up, grabbed the phone receiver, and dialed the internal security line. Dead air. Moretti's crew. Luca had mentioned them. A rival syndicate trying to push into Dominic's territory. They must have breached the freight elevator. The gunfire stopped, replaced by shouting in the main dining room. Heavy boots crunched over broken glass. Check the back, a rough voice yelled. Chloe clamped a hand over her mouth. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked around the office. There was no secondary exit, just the door she came through. She was a waitress, a manager. She wasn't built for this. The office door kicked open. A man stepped in, sweeping a suppressed pistol across the room. He wore a dark jacket, his face shadowed. He took a step towards the desk. Chloe braced herself, her fingers desperately searching the floor for a weapon, a letter opener, a heavy book, anything. Suddenly, a shadow lunged from the doorway behind the gunman. There was a wet, sickening crunch of bone, and the gunman was thrown violently against the filing cabinet. He dropped the gun. Dominic was on him before he hit the floor. The brutality was absolute and efficient. Dominic didn't fight like a man trying to win. He fought like a man trying to destroy. He drove his knee into the man's ribs, followed by a sharp, twisting strike to the neck. The gunman went entirely limp. Dominic stood up, breathing heavily. His white shirt was torn at the shoulder, soaked in a dark, spreading stain. "Chloe," he grunted, his voice tight with pain. "Are you in here?" She scrambled out from under the desk. "I'm here. I'm okay." She looked at him and felt the blood drain from her face. The left side of his torso was saturated. He was holding his hand against his side, blood seeping through his fingers, dripping steadily onto the expensive Persian rug. "You're shot," she breathed. "Grazed." He corrected, leaning heavily against the doorframe. He looked out into the hallway. Luca cleared the main floor. Moretti sent 5 men. They're all down. But we can't stay here. The police will be here in less than 4 minutes. You need an ambulance, Dominic. No police, no hospitals, he said, his voice dropping an octave as pain flared. Luca is bringing the car around to the service garage. We need to move. Chloe didn't argue. She stepped up to him, slipping her shoulder under his good arm. He was heavy, built of dense muscle, but adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she had. "Walk," she ordered. They navigated the service hallway, stepping over debris and the very real, very dead body of another attacker. Chloe stared straight ahead. She didn't look at the blood. She didn't look at the faces. She focused on the heavy metal door of the freight elevator. They made it to the underground garage just as Luca pulled the Maybach up, the tires squealing on the polished concrete. Luca jumped out, his own face cut and bleeding, and helped Chloe shove Dominic into the back seat. "Safe house," Dominic bit out, his head falling back against the leather seat. "Already on it, boss," Luca said, slamming the doors and gunning the engine. The car tore out into the wet Chicago night. The streetlights flashed rhythmically through the tinted windows, illuminating the pale, sweaty sheen on Dominic's face. His breathing was getting shallow. "He's losing too much blood, Luca!" Chloe yelled over the hum of the engine. "Dr. West is meeting us there. 5 minutes out." Luca replied, taking a corner at 60 miles an hour. "Keep pressure on it, Chloe. Do not let him pass out." Chloe scrambled across the wide back seat. She didn't care about the silk dress. She didn't care about the boundaries between boss and employee. She unbuttoned the ruined shreds of Dominic's shirt, exposing the jagged, bleeding tear along his ribs. She pressed her bare hands directly over the wound, pushing down hard. Dominic hissed, his entire body going rigid. His hand shot out, wrapping around her wrist in a vice grip. "I know it hurts," she said, her voice shaking but her hand steady. "But if you bleed out in the back of this car, I will bring you back to life just to kill you myself. Do you hear me?" Dominic opened his eyes. Despite the pain, despite the chaos, the corner of his mouth twitched into a faint, blood-stained smirk. His grip on her wrist loosened, sliding down to lace his fingers through hers. His skin was cold. "Bossy," he whispered. "Shut up and stay awake." She snapped, a tear finally breaking free and tracking through the soot on her cheek. He didn't look away from her. The slate grey of his eyes was entirely focused on her face, anchoring him to the living world. "I'm awake, Chloe. I'm right here." They held each other's gaze in the dark, the scent of expensive leather now entirely overpowered by the sharp, metallic smell of blood. It was the moment the invisible wall between them finally shattered. He wasn't the kingpin. She wasn't the waitress. They were just a man bleeding in the dark, and the woman desperately trying to keep him whole. The safe house wasn't a dusty cabin in the woods. It was a sprawling, ultra-modern fortress on a private bluff overlooking Lake Michigan, 50 miles north of the city. High walls, wrought-iron gates, and armed men walking the perimeter with dogs. 3 days had passed since the shootout at the Sovereign. The club was officially closed due to a plumbing catastrophe. The local news hadn't reported a word about the gunfire. Dominic's money had swept the blood right under the rug. Chloe stood in the kitchen of the estate, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the grey, churning water of the lake. She held a mug of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She was a prisoner. A very comfortable, very pampered prisoner, but a prisoner nonetheless. "You haven't eaten." She didn't turn around. Dominic walked into the kitchen. He was moving slowly, favoring his left side, dressed in a loose grey sweater and dark sweatpants. Dr. West had stitched him up, 32 sutures along his ribs. "I'm not hungry," Chloe said, setting the mug down on the marble island. She finally turned to look at him. He looked pale, but the lethal energy was slowly seeping back into his frame. "Luca went into the city," Dominic said, opening the refrigerator to grab a bottle of water. "He packed up your apartment, brought your clothes, your books, anything you need." Chloe felt a cold spike of anger hit her chest. "He packed up my apartment without asking me?" "Moretti's men know who you are, Chloe. You were seen leaving the club with me. You're a loose end to them, a vulnerability." He closed the fridge and leaned against the counter. "You can't go back there." "So you just move my entire life into a box and lock me in your compound?" she demanded, stepping toward him. The fear of the last few days was rapidly transmuting into fury. "I didn't sign up for this, Dominic. I signed up to run a restaurant, not to dodge bullets, not to be collateral damage in a mob war." "I know," Dominic said quietly. He didn't raise his voice. He took the anger, absorbing it. "I want to go home," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "You don't have a home anymore," Dominic said. The words were brutal, but his tone was painfully soft. "If you walk out those gates, Leo Moretti will have you snatched off the street in an hour. He will use you to get to me, and he will not be gentle about it." Chloe stared at him, the reality of the situation crushing down on her. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "So what? I just live here now? A pet bird in a bulletproof cage?" Dominic pushed off the counter. He walked slowly across the kitchen until he was standing right in front of her. He reached out, his large, warm hands gently gripping her shoulders. "You are not a pet, Chloe. And this isn't a cage. This is a fortress, and I built it to keep the things I care about safe." His thumb brushed the side of her neck, right over her pulse point. His touch was electric, sending a shiver down her spine that had absolutely nothing to do with fear. "I dragged you into this," Dominic murmured, his eyes dropping to her lips before meeting her gaze again. "I knew I shouldn't have. The day I put you in my car, I knew you didn't belong in my world. But I couldn't let you walk away. I am a selfish man, Chloe. I take what I want, and I wanted you." Chloe's breath hitched. The air between them felt thick, charged with the adrenaline and terror of the past week. She should push him away. She should scream at him for ruining her quiet, miserable life. But as she looked up into his eyes, she saw the raw, exhausting truth. He was terrified. The man who owned Chicago was terrified of losing her. "Dominic," she whispered. Before he could close the distance, the kitchen doors swung open. "Dominic, is that you?" Chloe and Dominic stepped apart. Arthur stood in the doorway. He was wearing a thick cardigan, looking slightly bewildered, holding a worn chessboard under one arm. Dominic's posture instantly softened. "I'm here, Dad." Arthur looked at his son. Then his eyes drifted to Chloe. He squinted, the fog of dementia parting just enough for a moment of clarity to shine through. A warm, familiar smile spread across his wrinkled face. "I know you," Arthur said, stepping into the kitchen. "You gave me the soup. It was very good soup." Chloe felt a knot dissolve in her chest. She managed a genuine smile. "It's nice to see you again, Arthur. I'm glad you're safe. Dominic brought you home," Arthur said happily, setting the chessboard down on the island. He looked between the two of them, nodding approvingly. "Good. Good. A man needs a good woman to keep the cold out. Your mother always said a house without a woman is just a waiting room." Dominic cleared his throat, a faint wash of color hitting his cheeks. "Dad, we were just discussing security protocols." "Nonsense!" Arthur waved a hand dismissively. He looked directly at Chloe. "He acts tough, like a bear, but he's got a soft center. Just don't tell his goons I said that." Chloe let out a surprised laugh. For a moment, the Mafia war, the bullets, the blood, it all vanished. They were just a family in a kitchen. But the illusion was shattered a moment later by the shrill, jarring ring of the secure landline mounted on the wall. Dominic's face hardened. He walked over and picked up the receiver. "Speak." Chloe watched him. She saw the exact moment the bottom fell out of their fragile sanctuary. Dominic's shoulders locked, His knuckles went white around the plastic receiver, the color completely drained from his face, leaving behind a mask of pure, absolute murder. He hung up the phone without saying another word. "What is it?" Chloe asked, the dread pooling in her stomach. Dominic looked at her. The human was gone again. The kingpin had returned, and he brought hell with him. "Moretti didn't just hit the club," Dominic said, his voice a dead, hollow scrape. "He hit the safe houses in the city. He took Paulie Ganza." "Paulie? The guy from the club?" Chloe asked. "Why would he take him?" "Because Paulie handles the payouts," Dominic said, turning to walk toward the armory down the hall. "And because Moretti sent a message through Luca. He knows you're here, Chloe, and he knows exactly how much you mean to me." He stopped at the doorway, looking back at her. "Stay with my father. Lock the doors. No matter what you hear tonight, do not leave this house." The waiting was the worst part. Action had a rhythm. It had an adrenaline-fueled momentum that pushed the brain into a state of primitive survival. But waiting was a slow, grinding torture. It gave the mind too much time to conjure the worst possible outcomes. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the storm that had been brewing over Lake Michigan finally broke. Lightning fractured the bruised sky, illuminating the churning, white-capped waves. The rain hammered against the reinforced glass like handfuls of gravel. Inside the compound, the air was suffocatingly tight. Dominic had left 30 minutes ago with a team of 4 heavily armed men in unmarked SUVs. They were heading into the city to hit Moretti before Moretti could coordinate a full-scale assault on the lake house. A preemptive strike. A necessity, Dominic had called it. Chloe sat on the edge of a leather sofa in the center of the sprawling living room. The lights had been dimmed to emergency reserves, casting long, warped shadows across the hardwood floors. Arthur was sitting across from her in a heavy armchair, peacefully arranging his wooden chess pieces on the board. The chaos hadn't touched him. His mind, fractured and unpredictable, had wrapped him in a protective blanket of ignorance. He hummed a faint, tuneless melody, moving a white knight across the board. "My wife always hated the rain," Arthur said suddenly, not looking up from the board. "She said it ruined her garden, but I always liked it. It washes the dirt away, leaves everything clean for the morning." Chloe looked at him. The sheer normalcy of his voice was jarring against the backdrop of men holding automatic rifles in the hallway. "It's a bad storm tonight, Arthur," Chloe said quietly. Arthur paused. He looked up, his pale eyes catching the dim light. The fog had rolled back in, but there was an anchor of emotional intelligence left in him. He looked at Chloe, really looked at her, and his hand stopped moving. "You're frightened," he said softly. Chloe swallowed the lump in her throat. She wanted to lie. She wanted to put on the manager's face, the cool, detached mask she used to handle drunk patrons and angry chefs. But her hands were shaking. She clasped them tightly in her lap. "Yes," she admitted, "I am." Arthur stood up. He moved slowly, his joints stiff with age, and walked over to the sofa. He sat down next to her, the cushions sighing under his weight. He didn't say anything profound. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He simply reached out and patted her tightly clenched hands with his own cold, paper-thin fingers. "Dominic is a stubborn boy," Arthur murmured, patting her hand to a slow, steady rhythm. "He gets it from his mother. When he decides something is his, he doesn't let go. He'll come back. He always comes back for what's his." Before Chloe could process the weight of those words, the heavy oak doors leading to the foyer slammed open. Luca burst into the room. He was drenched, his suit ruined, his chest heaving. Blood trickled from a fresh laceration above his left eyebrow, washing down his face in a diluted, pink stream. Chloe was on her feet instantly. "Luca, what happened? Where is Dominic?" "It was a trap," Luca panted, leaning heavily against a marble column. He grabbed a radio from his belt, his thumb jamming the transmission button. "Perimeter, report. I need eyes on the main gate, now." Static hissed back. Then, a voice, tight with panic. "We have movement in the tree line. 4 vehicles approaching without lights. They cut the main power line at the road." Luca cursed violently in Italian. He dropped the radio and looked at Chloe. The polite, professional bodyguard was gone. This was a soldier preparing for a siege. Moretti leaked the intel about Paulie to draw Dominic into the city. Luca said, his voice a rapid-fire bark of information. "They ambushed us at the docks. Dominic stayed behind to hold the line so I could get back here. The men outside aren't a scouting party, Chloe. It's a hit squad, and they're here to wipe this place off the map." Chloe's stomach dropped out. Dominic stayed behind. The thought hit her like a physical blow to the ribs, but she didn't have time to process the grief or the terror. The panic rising in her chest met a sudden, icy wall of survival instinct. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice stripping down to absolute calm. Luca looked at her, a flash of grim respect in his eyes. "We go to the vault, now." He moved to Arthur, gently grasping the old man's arm. "Come on, Mr. Russo, time to go downstairs." "Downstairs? But the game isn't finished." Arthur protested mildly, clinging to a black rook. "We'll finish it later, I promise." Luca coaxed, pulling him upright. A deafening explosion rocked the foundation of the house. The shockwave shattered the floor-to-ceiling windows facing the lake. A hurricane of glass shards and freezing rain blasted into the living room. Chloe threw her arms over her face, turning away as the glass rained down against her back and shoulders. The heavy iron front gates had just been blown off their hinges. "Move!" Luca roared over the howling wind. He drew a heavy matte black pistol from his shoulder holster. Chloe grabbed Arthur's other arm. They scrambled across the ruined living room, slipping on wet hardwood and broken glass. Gunfire erupted outside, the sharp, cracking reports of rifles cutting through the thunder. Shouts echoed from the front lawn. The perimeter guards were engaging, but from the volume of fire, they were heavily outnumbered. They reached the grand staircase. The vault, a reinforced panic room Dominic had installed years ago, was 2 floors down, built into the bedrock beneath the basement. They made it down the first flight when the front doors of the estate splintered inward. Splinters of wood the size of javelins sprayed across the foyer. 5 men in tactical gear poured through the opening. The ambient light from the storm illuminated the long, lethal barrels of their weapons. Luca shoved Chloe and Arthur down the next flight of stairs. "Keep going. Do not stop until you hit the steel door." Luca didn't retreat. He stepped into the open landing, raised his weapon, and fired 3 rapid, deafening shots. The lead man in the foyer dropped like a stone. Return fire chewed the drywall to pieces. Plaster dust exploded in a blinding white cloud. Chloe dragged Arthur down the stairs, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She couldn't see. She could barely breathe through the dust. The noise was apocalyptic. They reached the basement corridor. At the end of the hall, past the wine cellar, was a heavy steel door with a biometric keypad. "Chloe, the code!" Luca yelled from the top of the stairs, firing blindly down into the foyer. "It's your birthday. 6 digits." Chloe froze. Her birthday. Dominic had programmed the multi-million-dollar panic room to her birthday. A man who supposedly trusted no one had handed her the keys to his only sanctuary. She slammed her fingers against the keypad. 081496. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed off the concrete walls. The steel door unsealed. She grabbed the handle and hauled it open with all her weight. Inside was pitch black until emergency LEDs flickered to life. She pushed Arthur inside. He was trembling now, the noise finally piercing through the fog of his dementia. He clutched the wooden chess piece to his chest. "I'm coming, Luca!" Chloe screamed up the stairwell. "Lock it!" Luca roared back. "Do not wait for me!" His sentence ended in a wet, sickening grunt. Chloe watched in horror as Luca tumbled backward down the basement stairs, his body going limp before he hit the bottom landing. A dark stain was rapidly spreading across the center of his chest. Footsteps thundered on the stairs above him. Chloe didn't think. She didn't weigh the odds. She lunged out of the vault, grabbed the collar of Luca's ruined suit jacket, and pulled. He was dead weight, easily 200 pounds of muscle. She dug her heels into the concrete and hauled him backward with a guttural scream of effort. A man rounded the corner of the stairwell, his rifle raised. He locked eyes with Chloe. She dragged Luca's legs over the threshold, slammed her hand against the interior release button, and threw her weight against the steel door. Sparks showered her face as bullets hammered against the closing door. The heavy latches engaged with a loud, final thud. Silence fell over the room, absolute and ringing. The inside of the panic room smelled of ozone and stale, filtered air. Chloe collapsed against the cold steel of the door, her lungs burning. She looked down. Her hands were coated in blood. Luca's blood. He was lying on his back in the center of the small room, his breathing shallow and rattling. Arthur was kneeling beside him, his hands hovering helplessly over the bullet wound in Luca's chest. The old man was weeping silently, tears tracking down his weathered face. Chloe scrambled over to Luca. She ripped off her own jacket, balled it up, and pressed it hard against his chest. "Keep your eyes open, Luca," she ordered, her voice shaking violently. "Do you hear me? Stay with me." Luca offered a weak, bloody grimace. "Told you. To lock the door." "Shut up! I don't take orders from you," she said, leaning her entire body weight onto her hands. The blood soaked through the fabric instantly, warm and sticky. Above them, muffled thuds vibrated through the ceiling. Moretti's men were tearing the house apart. Then, a heavy, rhythmic pounding started against the steel door. They were trying to breach it. "They can't get in." Luca coughed, pink foam bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Solid steel. Independent ventilation. We wait." "Wait for what?" Chloe choked out. "Dominic is in the city. The perimeter guards are dead. No one is coming, Luca." Luca shook his head slowly. "He'll come. He won't let them have you." An hour passed. It felt like a decade. The pounding on the door eventually stopped, replaced by the faint, muffled sounds of heavy machinery being dragged into the basement. They were setting up a thermal torch to cut through the hinges. Chloe sat on the floor, her hands cramped and stained dark red. Luca had passed out 20 minutes ago. His pulse was thready, a faint flutter under his skin. Arthur was sitting in the corner, rocking slightly, murmuring to a wife who had been dead for 10 years. Chloe looked at the steel door. The thick metal was beginning to glow with a faint, angry orange heat near the upper hinge. They were getting through. She stood up. Her legs felt like lead. She walked over to the gun safe mounted on the far wall. The door was open, stocked with matte black weapons she didn't know how to use. She bypassed the rifles and grabbed a heavy handgun. It felt cold and foreign in her grip. She walked back to the center of the room and stood in front of Arthur and Luca. She raised the gun, pointing it squarely at the center of the steel door. Her arms were shaking so hard she had to grip her right wrist with her left hand to stabilize the barrel. She was a waitress. She had spent her life calculating tips and managing inventory. She had never fired a gun. But as she watched the orange ring of the thermal torch slowly eat through the steel, she felt a strange, icy calm settle over her. She wasn't going to let them touch Arthur. She wasn't going to let them finish Luca. She didn't owe Dominic Russo anything. He had dragged her into this hell. But the men on the floor behind her, they were hers to protect, and she was going to make Moretti's crew bleed for every inch of ground they took. With a deafening shriek of tearing metal, the upper hinge gave way. The door sagged inward. Smoke poured into the room, stinging Chloe's eyes. A heavy steel boot kicked the door. It groaned, the lower latches bending under the stress. Another kick. The door crashed inward, hitting the concrete floor with an earth-shattering boom. Through the thick, swirling smoke, a figure stepped into the doorway. Chloe squeezed the trigger. The gun barked, bucking violently in her hands. The shot went wide, ricocheting off the concrete frame and throwing sparks into the air. She adjusted her grip, her finger tightening on the trigger again. "Chloe, stop!" The voice was rough, ragged, and completely familiar. The smoke cleared slightly. Dominic stood in the doorway. He looked like a man who had walked through a meat grinder. His face was streaked with soot and blood. His left arm hung limply at his side, the shoulder of his jacket torn to shreds. He held a heavy automatic rifle in his right hand, the barrel smoking. Behind him, the basement corridor was a slaughterhouse. Bodies in tactical gear lay awkwardly on the floor. Chloe dropped the gun. It clattered loudly against the concrete. Dominic dropped his rifle. He stepped over the fallen steel door and closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides. He didn't say a word. He just wrapped his uninjured arm around her, pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply. His chest was heaving against hers. He was trembling. The ruthless kingpin, the man who owned the city, was shaking like a leaf. "You're safe," Dominic whispered, his voice cracking. "I've got you. You're safe." Chloe wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face against his ruined shirt. She smelled gunpowder, blood, and the faint, familiar scent of cedar. She let out a dry, gasping sob, the adrenaline finally crashing out of her system. "Luca!" she managed to choke out, pulling back slightly to look at him. "He's hurt. He's hurt bad." Dominic looked past her, his eyes locking onto his bleeding lieutenant. The emotion on his face vanished, replaced instantly by cold, calculating efficiency. He pulled a radio from his belt. "Medical team to the basement vault. Now." He looked back at Chloe. His hand came up, his thumb gently wiping a smear of Luca's blood off her cheek. "It's over," Dominic said quietly. "Leo Moretti is dead. His lieutenants are dead. The war is over." Chloe looked into his slate-grey eyes. She saw the absolute truth in them. He had burned half the city to the ground to get back to this room. He didn't just want her. He had waged war for her. 3 weeks later, the skyline of Chicago was a jagged silhouette against the bruised purple of twilight. The city was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that only came after a storm had scrubbed the streets clean. Inside the Sovereign Club, the lights were low. The broken glass had been swept away. The bullet holes in the mahogany paneling had been filled, sanded and varnished until they were nothing but dark, smooth scars. The club was closed to the public for the night. Chloe stood behind the heavy oak bar, polishing a crystal rocks glass with a white linen towel. She wore a tailored black suit, her hair pulled back into a severe, elegant twist. She moved with a practiced, fluid grace. She set the glass down and poured 2 fingers of Macallan 25. She turned and slid the glass across the polished wood. Dominic caught it. He was sitting on a leather bar stool, the only patron in the massive room. He wore a dark charcoal suit, his tie loosened. He still moved a little stiffly, the bullet wound in his shoulder still healing, but the lethal, coiled energy was fully back in his frame. He took a slow sip of the scotch, watching her over the rim of the glass. "Luca's out of the ICU," Dominic said, his voice low and smooth. "He was asking about you. Wanted to know if you were still giving orders." Chloe offered a faint, dry smile. "Tell him I'll dock his pay if he doesn't get back to the floor by next month." Dominic chuckled, setting the glass down. The sound was warm in the empty room. He leaned his elbows on the bar, closing the physical distance between them. "The regional bosses are meeting tomorrow night. The Moretti territory is being absorbed. The transition is going to be complicated. They're going to push back." Chloe picked up another glass and began wiping it down. She didn't flinch at the mention of the rival bosses. 3 weeks ago she would have panicked. Now she just processed it as data. "Let them push," Chloe said calmly, her eyes fixed on the glass. "You control the shipping routes now. You squeeze the supply lines at the docks for 2 weeks, and they'll be begging to sit at your table. Don't offer them a seat. Make them earn it." Dominic went entirely still. He stared at her, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. It was a look of absolute, burning admiration. "You realize," Dominic murmured, "that you sound like a mob boss." Chloe stopped polishing. She looked at him, tossing the towel over her shoulder. She leaned across the bar, her face inches from his. "I sound like a manager," she corrected softly. "You own the building, Dominic. I just make sure the floor runs smoothly." Dominic reached out, his hand wrapping gently around the back of her neck. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. His touch was warm, heavy with a promise that had nothing to do with business. "You're not just a manager, Chloe," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "You haven't been just a manager since the day you threw that apron at Gregory's feet." He pulled her across the polished wood, sealing his mouth over hers. The kiss was slow, deep, and bruising. It tasted like expensive scotch and the bitter, metallic tang of survival. It was an anchor in a world built on quicksand. Chloe kissed him back, her fingers tangling in the collar of his shirt, pulling him closer. She knew exactly who he was. She knew the blood on his hands, the violence that built the empire he stood on. She had seen him kill. She had seen him bleed. And she didn't care. When they finally broke apart, the air between them was heavy and charged. Dominic rested his forehead against hers, his breathing slightly ragged. "My father asked about you today," he whispered. Chloe smiled softly. "How is he?" "He told me to stop dragging my feet and marry the girl who bought him the soup." Dominic pulled back slightly, looking directly into her eyes. The slate grey was entirely stripped of its armor. He was completely exposed. "I told him I was working on it." Chloe stared at him, her heart skipping a beat. It wasn't a proposal, it was a statement of fact. In Dominic Russo's world, there was no backing out. Once he claimed something, it was his forever. And for the first time in her life, Chloe didn't want to run. "Tell Arthur," she said, her voice steady and clear, "that the soup was the best investment I ever made." Dominic smiled. He leaned in and kissed her again, sealing the contract. Outside, the city of Chicago hummed with the brutal, endless machinery of ambition and greed. It was a city that ate the weak and broke the innocent. But inside the penthouse, behind the bulletproof glass and the velvet curtains, the new queen of the syndicate had finally taken her throne. And she wasn't going anywhere. If you found yourself holding your breath during the siege or cheering for Chloe as she took control of the syndicate, don't leave just yet. Hit that like button to show your support for stories with fierce, grounded heroines and complex, ruthless anti-heroes. Share this video with your friends who love a gritty, high-stakes mafia romance that doesn't hold back on the action. And most importantly, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another intense, pulse-pounding original story. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment? Let's keep the story going.